Good afternoon, everyone. I've caught you all at the coffee hour. Sorry, you'll be able to sneak away shortly. It is such a pleasure to be here. And as I listen to Dr. Addy's presentation, it's really this perspective of how do we bring it all together. And that's a lot of work that we have to do. So I'm excited to tell you a little bit about a journey. I'm going to use a neuroscience, counseling, life experience story to tell you, some of my favorite. But I would be best suited to start off with a lyric by Pink. So Pink is busy singing her lyrics in Boston while I am here in DC quoting her. And so what's important about that is, lyrics say so much to us. Music is powerful. It gets to our soul. It's a soul of memories, but it's also really painful. And sometimes it's okay to sit in that pain. And so, I don't like to talk about my feelings. I take another hit. I'll find another fake fix because it's easier than healing. And so what does that mean? People ask me what kind of work I do, and my first elevator pitch was that I study the neurobiology of what were you thinking? So we all know teenagers. And then I started thinking, well, it's not just teenagers who have what were you thinking moments, but it's also adults. We have those moments as well. What was I thinking? So as I thought through really the depths of what my goal is and the work of my lab and my collaborators and colleagues, I really started to think that, well, maybe it's more that the work of our lab is to help people, kids, feel more comfortable in their skin, right? Because it's not easy. And if we think about just the very basic definition of adolescence, I can ask you, how many people in the room are clinicians? Show of hands. How many people are neuroscientists or basic scientists? How many people have been an adolescent? Oh, for better or for worse, we have all traversed a painful period of life. The transitional period between childhood and adulthood, which can be a turbulent time. And I love that part of Webster's definition said not only for teenagers themselves, but for parents also. And so what does that mean? We think about adolescence and the evolutionary drive to make it through this period of life that is so important. And everywhere we go, we're starting to hear, there's a lot of focus on adolescence, of course. This is the second decade of life. Why is it so important? Well, a lot of people think about adolescence, and some of you in the audience may have had this experience. You tell your kids, it'll never be this good again as when you're young. It's like skydiving. It's exhilarating. There's opportunities to be had, a fresh slate, all the things. Oh, but that's only a small part of the story. We also know that life is an incredible roller coaster ride, especially for teenagers. And I would be absolutely remiss if I didn't mention the influence of peers. Do I have the right genes? I always make bad neuroscience jokes. I'm like, not these genes. Do I have the right genes to be able to have a life that, can be full of joy and not a lot of emotional distress? Am I in the right group? Am I on Instagram? Am I on Snapchat? There's a lot going on during this very short period of time. It also happens to overlap with some of the biggest developmental processes that occur throughout the entire lifespan. And so the work of my lab has been really interested in kind of looking at the interface of all of these, because at that same time, the second decade of life, when kids are going through the teenage years, we also know that there is often the initiation of first substance use, alcohol use, marijuana use, nicotine use, a time for experimentation. Was that part of the evolutionary drive to get out of the nest and go, make sure that I go into the wild to move my genetics to another area of the forest and not be eaten by a predator? Well, it's not the same as the risks that our adolescents who have that same wired brain, wired for novelty seeking and experimentation. Now there are drastic harms that can be fatal at times. And so if we think about adolescence, a lot of brain development going on. Same time that kids are starting to experiment with substances, that it doesn't matter how old you are, you introduce a substance to a cell in the body, it's going to change how it functions. That does not discriminate against age or any other process. Cells react, they adapt, or they are affected in the presence of substances. But also mental health. We also know that during the adolescent period, we often see the onset of depressive symptoms, of anxiety. I don't have to talk about COVID and the pandemic and the mental health crisis that's really gripped a lot of people, particularly kids. And so the question is, where do all of these things overlap? So at the same time my brain's doing all this really important work, I'm starting to try some substances, and I'm depressed and anxious, that's a lot of pieces. But if you look, there's a lot of overlap in terms of the features. If you didn't know what my population was and you just looked at some of these characteristics, we'd say, oh, risk-taking. We know that teenagers can be risk takers and impulsive. We also know that in some addictions, that's one of the hallmarks. We also know that in some mental health disorders, that there are issues with impulsivity. What about cognitive function? Now, it's way too pejorative to say the teenagers have impaired cognitive function, although some parents may disagree, but I'm an optimist, so I like to think that they are on their way up to developing these good cognitive processes. What about brain tissue? What about brain function and brain chemistry? So my lab is really interesting at looking at the convergence of all of these different pieces. And if you actually look in the literature, you will see, as I said, adolescence is a hot topic. If you do a search on PubMed, National Library of Medicine, to tell you what's been published in this topic, you can see there has been an explosion in the number of people doing research. So if you just type in adolescence and any of these other terms, brain, mental health, addiction, alcohol, marijuana, tobacco, vaping, social media, you can see that. So I came to McLean Hospital in 2001. And in the last 20 years alone, we've gone from about 2,000 publications to 10,000 publications. Why? Is it because all of a sudden we're interested in adolescence? Well, part of it is because people have started to realize that, wow, there's a lot of overlap. We now know, we used to know, we've known a lot about how the brain works for a very long time, but a lot of it really has to do with advances in technology. And so because we have brain imaging technologies, we have a non-invasive way to have a window into the brain. We actually can study the living, breathing human teenager and look at the changes in brain. So we might have known a lot of things about addiction, mental health, and adolescence through postmortem studies or animal studies. All of these elements are very important to put together. But imaging has given us literally a window into the brain to watch that development in real time. And so, again, this is not new information, but what makes it new is our ability to be able to capture it, is that we know that when you see children, young children, they're very dependent on their caregivers, right? They can't do anything. They can't eat by themselves, they can't get around by themselves. And then slowly, over the course of time, through this fantastic symphony of neuronal activation, development, activity, exposure, experience, we have this, pruning of neurons that we don't need. We're born with more neurons than you ever have in your entire lifetime, and we slowly prune away the ones that are the best of the best. And then we take those neurons and we make them really good communicators with each other. We add white matter so they're connected better. This is how, again, neuroscience joke, this is how you get better cell service. I'm gonna let you just sit on that one for a second. But it's really important to understand that we have a neurobiological process that is designed for efficiency and effective and taking an organism and taking them through an adaptive process. And so pruning, myelinating, all ongoing, happens early in life, but it just so happens that there are parts of the brain that come online last. We know, we've heard a whole lot about the frontal lobe. What the frontal lobe gives us, executive functions, the ability to have abstract thought, reasoning, decision-making, judgment. And so if we think about the last part of the brain to come online, we think about impulsiveness as a characteristic of being an adolescent. Well, we also know at the same time that that brain is incredibly vulnerable. So if we think about it, if we think about, trying out substances or experiencing depression or anxiety, all the things, because as Pink says, it hurts to be human. And that's not untrue. And the question is, how do we find joy? How do we balance that? How do we balance all the negative that's out there that we have to manage and be able to take our neurobiology and think in that same direction? And so, I use alcohol as one example, again, because it's easier than healing. We think about these applications. So when I was in undergrad, I was very interested in the biology of the brain. Not to reveal any age, but it wasn't even called neuroscience in my class. It was Introduction to Psychobiology. And so I thought, oh, this is amazing. It's biology and it's the brain. And I was so wrapped up in my own miserable experience as an adolescent that I was like, I need to know more about this. Oh, but I can't work with people. They're too hard. I can't hold my own stuff. How in the world could I hold anybody else's? So med school, no thank you. Oh, I love science. I love research. And so in thinking about all these different pieces, some of the biggest statistics that are out there, we know that, as I said, adolescence is a big time for the initiation of substance use. About 6 million Americans between ages 12 and 20 currently Consume alcohol. Now, I can have many other different presentations. We can talk about cannabis. We can talk about nicotine and vaping. We could talk about any substance. For the purpose of today, I'm going to tell you the alcohol adolescent story because, again, this is a pretty commonly used substance early in life. And so about 14% of 10th graders report current alcohol use, 30% of 12th graders, 17 report binge drinking. What is binge drinking? We'll talk about that a little more, but it's drinking a lot of drinks in a short period of time and reaching a really high blood alcohol level very quickly. And so one of the things we know, and I do a lot of community outreach, because like Dr. Addy, I am entirely committed and passionate about being a neuroscience interpreter. It is part of my job to understand the science, conduct the science, understand the science, but then give it back to the community, because that is how we help people feel better in their skin. That is how we help to alleviate mental distress. And so one of the things we know is that the earlier the onset of first use, and if you think about that developmental timeline, the frontal lobe is the last part of the brain to come online. As we get older, neurobiological adulthood is said to occur in the mid-20s. We used to think when you got to be 18 and you could vote or you could get a mortgage or do all the things that 18-year-olds don't do at all, it was the age of majority. We used to think that the brain stopped growing. But we know, again, fantastic symphony going on in the brain. So we have a lot of opportunity. And at the same time, if we introduce something like alcohol, if you start drinking when you're 13, there's almost a 50% chance that that person will have an alcohol use disorder later in life. If you wait until age 16, it goes down to 30%. That's a big improvement. If you wait to 18, 17%. If you wait until the legal age in the United States, which is legal in the United States to drink, it goes down to 9%. It is never zero. The only way to not have risk for alcohol use disorder is to never drink alcohol. And about 2/3 of our country will drink some form of alcohol, from very low amounts to very dangerous amounts. And so I'm sure you're asking the question, but what about Europe? They're all okay in Europe because they drink young. Actually, every single country in Europe, with the exception of Turkey, has higher rates of alcohol use disorder in their youth compared to the United States. This is about neurobiology. This is about brain development, and it's about the impact of substances that aren't supposed to be there during this developmental process. And so what does that mean? Age of first use has a big impact. Well, this is where I said at the end of undergrad, I went to Union. I went on to the State University of New York at Binghamton to work with Linda Spear to do alcohol research, because again, I was like, humans are not for me. I worked at a brain trauma center, and there was a woman who had survived a heroin overdose. She couldn't speak. She pointed to a picture of her daughter, and I just thought, the human condition is really hard, and I don't have what it takes to be that person. Oh, but I could do research. And so we did a number of studies that this was, Linda Spear was one of the pioneers in the field of understanding adolescent brain development and the impact of alcohol. One of the things we know in this study, again, based on epidemiologic, the public health concern is that kids use alcohol. They start using when their brain is developing. Oh, this is a really important point. So preclinical versus clinical interface. Why is it so important for us to partner together between basic neuroscience or other sciences and the clinical end, or clinical research / clinical practice? Because so this was kind of the quote we all learned in Linda Spear's lab. Due to the ethical considerations against administering alcohol to human youth, animal models have become very, very important. You can't, for the sake of science, take an adolescent, give them alcohol, and see what happens, because we know it's going to damage the process of brain development, the process of functioning in general. So this was, off I went to the lab, and I said, well, okay, let's study adolescence. You can manipulate the brain of an adolescent in a way that you can't do in human models, so let's see if we can understand the basic neurobiology. So the first study that I conducted, my friends went off to either industry or business worlds, and they said, well, what are you doing in graduate school? I said, well, I'm getting rats drunk. They found this very interesting. So this is a living rodent. You got to see a lot of rodents during these sessions. This is a rodent who has lost their righting reflex. What that basically means is if you take an animal, you put them on their back, it's a very vulnerable position, they have a primitive reflex to actually right themselves. Well, if you give them alcohol and you put them on their back, they can flip over until they can't. And then they spend a very long time on their back. So this is really the experimental model of alcohol pass out. And so one of the things we found that was pretty staggering at the time was that teen rats are significantly less impaired by alcohol effects, sedation, compared to adults. How does that translate into the public? Well, whenever I give presentations to students, to parents, to teachers, name the permutation of the presentation I've given, we can't drink like we could when we were young. Why is that? You have one glass of wine and you're sleepy, slurring your words. Oh, I've had enough. I can't drink like I used to. Well, if you look at the animal preclinical data, what we actually see, it bears out in the data. So in the first category here, we see that on the left, you see teens. And what this measures on the axis is basically how long they laid on their back before they regained a basic reflex. They were still living, they weren't sleeping, they just didn't have the reflex to turn themselves over. And what we found was that a teenage animal, for anybody who's, the science end around a P30 day, postnatal day 30 rodent, what we saw was that they slept, they were passed out for about 2 hours. Wow, that sounds really long. Except look at the adults follow it over. More than twice, 4 hours. I watched one male adult rodent sleep for 13 hours. And I was like, come on, buddy, get up now. But the idea was staggering, that there was such a dramatic difference between the sensitivity of youth to alcohol in adults. So the equivalent would be that if I had an adolescent and adult, I gave them the same amount of alcohol based on their body weight, and I had the adult walk from here to there, they would swagger, they would clearly know they're intoxicated. At the same blood alcohol level, the adolescent would walk from here to there, you would have no idea that they were drinking. So when kids walk in the house, don't smell their breath, there's ways around that, and don't make them walk the line, because they're relatively unimpaired. But the important part of the story here is, what does that mean? The teenage brain, the adolescent brain, has this neurobiological adaptation to protect itself from a harmful substance, so much that they have to drink a whole lot to dangerous levels to be able to feel that same feeling. And there's tolerance. So there are a lot of different pieces to all of this, but what is the mechanism here? And this is kind of the beauty of where the preclinical, clinical, the translational neuroscience end of things really comes together. So what are the mechanisms here? What makes that adolescent brain so unaffected? This is really important. What could it be? So I said to Linda at the time, Linda, wouldn't it be really cool if we could make a teenager look like an adult? She's like, oh, no, not yet. We have like 5 other experiments to do. But you've lived a good life as a scientist when you've actually still talk about your dissertation data like 20 years later. And so what we measured was 2 neurochemicals in the brain. And so, I know Dr. Addy talked about dopamine a little bit. My passion, my neurotransmitter of passion, they didn't have the socks at the table, is GABA. So GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It's one of the most important neurotransmitters that opposes glutamate, the excitatory neurotransmitter. These 2 systems make our whole selves run. And so what does that really mean? When you're young, your GABA levels are actually really low. So as your brain is developing, your GABA levels are slowly also maturing. Maybe that's partially why you're so impulsive, behaviorally impulsive when you're young, is because your GABA levels aren't very high. That makes a lot of sense. On the other side of the coin, our glutamate levels, so our excitatory neurochemical that's really important for learning and memory, long-term potentiation, we know that that is overexpressed when you're a teenager, and it only slowly prunes to reach adult levels. Well, the way alcohol works, so next time if you have a cocktail and you're drinking, you're like, oh, I know what you're doing right now, alcohol. You are increasing my GABA levels. If we think, these are the conversations I have at least. If you drink alcohol, it raises your GABA levels. At the same time, it blocks your excitation, blocks your glutamate. So maybe that's why kids are so less sensitive, because their GABA's low. And as it turns out, if you look at the data, if you look at the bottom graph and the left set of bars where you have the green bar that says GABA agonist, that is an adolescent given alcohol and something that potentiated the GABA system. So we made GABA levels adult-like in the teenagers, gave them alcohol, and they looked exactly like adults given alcohol alone. So this is a far stretch from sitting in a clinic with an adolescent sitting across from you. I recognize that. So one of the credentials that I am proudly able to now display that wasn't mentioned in the beginning is, after this career as a neuroscientist, I recently became a mental health counselor. I said, oh, I need the full circle here. So trained as a behavioral neuroscientist, I've done clinical neuroimaging at McLean for the last 20 plus years, and now I sit on the couch across from teenagers. And I will go so far as to say that I have learned almost as much from clients that I've sat with as I've learned in my 25-year career as a neuroscientist. And all that reminds me is that all of these pieces are so critical and so crucial together. And so what does that really mean? Teens look behaviorally like adults. That's the way sedatives work, by the way. Increases your GABA levels. There's a whole other host of things that's interesting about GABA. One is that GABA is implicated in addictive disorders, in depression, in anxiety disorders, and sleep disturbances. Now, yes, there are a whole other world of neurotransmitters out there, but one of the things that we know across each of these different conditions is that GABA levels in the brain, particularly in the frontal lobe, are low. GABA is a really important neurochemical that is developmentally low. Well, next stage, leave graduate school. I don't think I want to do animal research anymore. What should I do now? I want to teach. I love teaching. I love talking to the public. McLean Hospital. Oh, when I went to give my job talk, they said, do you know that we can study GABA in the brain? I was like, stop the presses. What? This is amazing. That same non-invasive window into the brain can now study this neurochemical that is so critical in mental health, in development, in addiction. And that's actually what we did. No one had done it in, this was back in the early beginning of the 2000s, and no one had actually measured just GABA levels in a healthy adolescent before they used any substances. And lo and behold, guess what we found? This is where, rigor and reproducibility in science is critical. We have to find something and then we have to reproduce it. And we have to be rigorous in the way that we do it. And so what we found was that GABA levels in the frontal lobe, not another part of the brain, were lower in adolescence. Nothing to write home about, but an important piece of the story. Well, we looked in adults who were binge drinkers. So remember, GABA increases, alcohol increases GABA levels over time. We actually saw that in binge drinkers, guess what took a hit? Their GABA levels. If you drink, your GABA levels actually go down over time. What does that make me think? It's also connected to depression and anxiety. But isn't this a chicken or the egg question? So how do we know the kids start drinking because GABA's low that makes them impulsive? Or maybe it's because it hurts to be human and kids are under emotional distress. And they think, well, if I can find myself a temporary fix to feel better for a moment, maybe that's what I'll do. Well, we actually did that study and recently found that we recruited kids who were teenagers. We scanned their brains before they had ever drank alcohol, and we followed them for 3 years. And what we found was when we went back and looked at the half of the sample who went on to use substances, alcohol, nicotine, marijuana, they actually had lower GABA in their frontal lobe to begin with. So what does that mean? By virtue of being an adolescent, there is a developmental vulnerability. So we think about adolescence as a great time of opportunity. We also think about adolescence as a period of vulnerability. And so how do you go back and forth and do this dance? I think one of the most exciting pieces is that we want to answer questions about the human condition, about how it feels and how we can find more joy and what types of things it will take. Well, one of the things that now connects us in a new way is technology. Because we started in animal models, we wanted to translate this into the human condition. We developed all this amazing technology, and now we're using that same technology where we find these patterns and networks in animals and go back to humans or go back to animals, go back and forth. We have the same networks and the same ability to be able to capture these important brain regions. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't say that there are things you just can't capture in animal models. Some of the things my lab is most excited about are things like forgiveness. We know that forgiveness is linked to frontal lobe brain development. It's also linked to anxiety and depression. Well, what if we did a forgiveness intervention with kids? Could that help bolster their GABA levels or some other developmental process? When I say forgiveness, of self, of situation, of others. We're also interested in social connection. How do we measure spirituality? How do we measure so many different components, ethnic, racial diversity, gender identity, sexual orientation? We can't model all of those things in animal models, but what we can do is use the animal models to look at the circuitry, figure out what's at play in humans, and then start to ask some questions. And so just to come back and to kind of end on the note of saying, well, because it's easier than healing, age of first use of alcohol is also related to depression and anxiety in youth. So chicken or the egg question. Now, as someone who is a card-carrying credentialed mental health counselor, I could say, well, we know that, major depressive disorder anxiety disorders, they're really prevalent and they're raging. During my internship, I had a number of kids who came up on a clinical anxiety screener. And so, worry beyond their imagination, and parents want to have a response to that, and the schools want to have a response. So how do we help them? So sometimes I sit and I have the ability to be like, so let's talk about your amygdala. Let's talk about the parts of your brain that are feeling that way. And let's just sit with the bad feelings for a minute. Because if you sit with the feelings and you say them out loud, that in and of itself has been shown, it's been published, can actually help you feel better. And so think about all the opportunities for the advancement and the models that we can use and bring together and be able to say, well, so much anxiety, so much depression. Half of the kids who screen for anxiety and depression at the same time also have a tendency to co-use substances. Now, a lot of times when I'm speaking to parents, I try to remind them, they're looking in the chart, start at 50% chance of an alcohol use problem. I'm like, this is not about you. We're talking about kids. Right? We're talking about today in 2023 and all of the things that we have to really think about and be mindful of. And, we all belong here. How do we help kids feel like they belong? What are the links? Is it a self-medication, or is it something caused by the substances, or both? And so I feel like I always want to try to get a good Hamilton quote. What comes next in terms of what we're going to do? Electric light, we are only about 100 years out from electric light changing the world, right? So electric light brought nightlife. We couldn't do anything at night unless it was candlelight. Now we are all thinking about social media and devices and connectivity and all of the things. Our brains are born to adapt. It's not going to be easy. There will be things that we have to be mindful of in ways that we have to think about anxiety, depression, or other mental health disorders. But we can do this. We can come together with all the different pieces. And I feel such gratitude that I've had the support through my career and my colleagues and collaborators to be able to go from preclinical neuroscientist all the way to a mental health counselor. And I feel like the best advice I can give is look to the data sets. There are amazing projects that exist. These are just some examples through NIAAA that are funded. These are big, huge, publicly available data sets. The last one, the ABCD study, is a study of 10,000 kids being conducted over the course of 10 years. No single lab could pull that off. Not even 2 labs. It's taking 21 labs in an entire country to be able to collect all these data from 10,000 kids over 10 years. That what may be the most important decade of one's entire lifespan. Because maybe what we do in this second 10 years of life is really going to be what predicts what preserves our memory, preserves our ability to have good social interaction. There's a lot to protect. So with that, I just again want to thank you for your attention. Thank you for hanging in there for my story of adolescence and GABA and alcohol and putting it all together. And again, gratitude for this society and others to be able to come together and have the conversations. It's not only how we talk to each other, but it's generating ideas, creative ideas. And I feel very enthusiastic and very optimistic about the information that will come. So thank you very much, everyone, for your attention.